Friday.
It's my father. Yo sé. Yo lo digo. Sí, sí, no, tiro, tiro, pero con las reglas, que a veces. Sí.
You don't put them, it's stop fighting. Your seat. I think turkey. Very nice.
There's quite the church group back there today. Everyone's afraid.
I feel like I'm trying not to think of English spirits and then priorities. But I sometimes. I went fast food, so I played with this country. And I was 6 years old. It was to our heads. I see the new man. I'll see him again. It was so considered.
No, but thank you.
How do you speak to hey, how are you?
Where?
Atlanta. So
You
don't need to worry.
Dice literal como
That's cultural.
David Collier, es como el representante histórico de Did you point to the master?
No, obviamente.
En el muchísimo, ¿sabes? Me dice, no a los que van para pero te tienes que hacer el pero ahí I you know what I'm like I just like es imposible. Yeah, the one that I created. Sí, yo igual. Bueno, igual como me tomo mucho. Yeah, like this but I see it is very short.
Era solo,
Esta quillera.
ahora todo termina el superior.
Sí, no, para, bueno, la verdad es que
Arriba sigue el signo norte. Claro, eso ya se podía dejar.
Yes, you're gonna bend something. Sí, claro. Por eso es. Hay un montón de. No, pero por alguna razón no está chula. Así que habría que sacar porque era sí, son maybe that's no, that they receive some la lista igual there. Más sí, bueno, que recibir. Sí, igual que los datos se pensan de una manera de porque claro, como es no
Se explicando el panorama para las diferenciales
podría data directamente al proyecto, podría hacer algo con la plata, eso sí. Igual puede hacer datos se piensa sí es.
Van a ser años de construcción. Puede ser para atrás, pero medio. Es la mano ahí. Esa era para todos MBA.
Pero poder como diferencia todo el año. Ahora voy a
Entonces, un gran asset de Estados Unidos.
No lo había visto.
Darse que visualiza.
Hoy lo vi.
Buscar trabajo. Es ahora
Están diciendo, no, en realidad esta pregunta clave, eso sí, para
no.
como decía la otra vez, Aníbal, explicaba
La tarde voy a pegar este show.
Ya la semana pasada ya
se está
no sabemos cada semana en México pasa algo. Vamos a ver.
la justicia electoral, la consejería
Bueno,
me cambia 5 grados de temperatura. Es una larga historia.
sí, vamos a
Si yo fuera tú, si un asiento, es uno de Morfina, somos el grupo de chicos de la isla. Y yo presenté.
Están haciendo me parecería chévere, creo que sería para ellos interesantes.
You did a poster and then you also
Más and so much is that like they and that I gotta that's like not very good. Yes, I sent the paper to the channel that one of people to let me know if we do that. something else, which I thought that it was what I should, and they kind of confirmed that, I just always did something else. Maybe some good ideas, so.
Right.
Yeah.
That sounds really productive.
That was like.
I don't think I've ever had where I walked away feeling like.
Like the stars started quick, so like the discussion on the panel was like so excited about the super. And was doing something sort of similar, but first person. Like, I have a bunch of ideas. Like I was having a meeting, like a one-on-one issue with me. So we had a meeting. I'm just talking about like. Like.
What about your extracurricular activities? Do you have fun? My God. O si no, agarrarle con ellos con que no están secuenciados por edades. No tienen.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Kellogg community, I am very pleased to welcome Maria Victoria Murillo to the University of Notre Dame. Vicky's a professor in the Department of Political Science at CIPA at Columbia University. She is a scholar that really stands out, not only for her theoretical creativity and deep knowledge of Latin America, but also for being a scholar that has always been at the forefront of what will be the next big and important research agenda in comparative politics. So going all the way back to her first book, where she spotlighted the role of labor and market reforms, to her work on non-programmatic party competition and the effects of institutional weakness, to her more recent research agenda on the activation of low contentious politics across the developing world. And now she's presenting a forthcoming book on why Latin Americans are increasingly dissatisfied with democracy, despite the vast material gains in the last decade, which I guess this means that all of us will be studying this question in the coming years. I'm so grateful for Vicky for joining us here today. And before I pass it on to our speaker, let me just say to the people that are streaming online, there is directly before the viewing window the possibility for you to enter any questions you might have for our speaker. Thank you, Vicky.
Okay, Kellogg to have me back to Notre Dame. It's a pleasure to be among so many faces and friends and colleagues whose work I admire, and to be able to present the book here. Really, I'm very, very thankful. So this book is an edited volume that's finally in production. You might ask me about the book. The book only takes longer than it's supposed to. Which looks at the decade of political discontent that we more or less argue happens at the end of the commodity boom. So from 2014 to 2024, this is not a process that has ended, but of course, you need to submit the book. And really, it's a time where Latin America was characterized by an increase in anti-government protest and an increase in anti-incumbent vote that I'm just going to show. We argue that the Latin American process of discontent is distinct from what's happening in other parts of the world, in particular from the global north, where there is all this series of those who are left behind. Because in Latin America, there was not such a glorious past to be lost. And so it's a little bit of a different structure, although of course there are common characteristics such as the importance of social media and so on and so forth. And we also argue that, in a sense, this discontent with democracy was to be expected of the success of democracy itself. So those are the claims we made. This is a book edited with Gabriel Kessler. The name should be there, but it was there. Who's an Argentine sociologist, and it came out of a conference. We have a lot of edited of chapters that I'm going to be mentioning through the presentation that help us think about the argument. So we started with, I started my tenure as the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies in the year 2019, which was a year that was like the wave of discontent and protest until COVID hit. And so what you have here is probably the most famous of all, which is the Chilean 2019 uprising. And the most famous because it was less expected of all, and we're going to talk about. So, but it was not just unique. If you look at the vote of the last decade, this is a little bit, to be honest, this is the decade, and I don't know how to work with this. If you look at the 1980s and 1990s, we see that incumbents rarely win the elections. We get into the commodity boom, the 2003-2014 period, and we saw that incumbents were likely to win re-election. The party of the incumbent had an advantage. And then when we get to the last decade, the post-commodity boom decade, as we see, the incumbent is in blue, the opposition is in red, and you can see most of it is red, very little blue. So people are voting against incumbents, which is not so surprising because we know from the work of Dani Campero and Cesar Suco that Latin Americans, tend to blame the president on economic cycles, even when those economic cycles were exogenous generators. The other thing that happened, this is from the Gelt Daytown protest events, is again, if you look before this is the commodity boom, and this is the decade of the commodity boom, and if you just look at the sheer number of anti-government protests in Latin America, it increased dramatically in this decade. So it does show us that people are voicing their discontent with the way the system is working. And of course, I think there is an alternative, which is exit, and I think that's why we mentioned it. Immigration flows grow in this period, so some people vote with their feet and leave the region or their countries, because migration also grows within the region. And then, of course, there is the other alternative, and I guess, Memo, you can enlighten us, but we have two chapters on the role of crime, which works both as a safety net and a tool for social mobility in this period. So people can choose that option. But we're interested in political voice, why people are discontent, and this starts even before COVID hit Latin America. COVID hit particularly strong Latin America. The GDP of the region falls more than that of the rest of the world, and employment falls more than the rest of the world, and reported deaths are also higher, probably because of, we can discuss why this is the case, but it hits very, very hard. So we entered 2019, and we entered with this idea. I remember that was the first event I organized as an institute director on the wave of political discontent. But what we noticed in trying to theorize this political discontent is that there's kind of two expressions. One expression that we call vertical discontent, that is more systemic. People are unhappy with all political elites. This is shown in, electoral fragmentation, in elections. If you look into the 2019 presidential elections in Guatemala, the two most voted candidates got 25% of the vote, and then the eventual winner in the second round, 14% of the vote. So people are not happy with any of the options. There's not a lot of positive feelings. They keep trying. There's high electoral volatility, changing from one election to the election. Everybody's Peru, if you want to say. I guess, by the way, in Peru, in the 2021 election, same thing, 19% to Castillo, 13% to Keiko Fujimori. So that was one type of discontent that threw everybody out, and se va con todos, that we characterize as political discontent. In terms of protest, we think that the characterization is the same. If you look at the 2019 protest in Chile that started in October in 2019, when there was an increase in the price of the fare, the protests were super diverse, they grew dramatically, they had no leadership, no organization, thousands of demands. The government didn't know what to do with them. In fact, the government negotiated with the political parties that were not represented in the protest a constitutional reform, which wasn't what the protest was really asking of. But this shows you that there was no way of organizing these protests. The alternative is what we call horizontal discontent. There's a lot being written on polarization, including in this country. So I guess you know what I'm talking about. This is when people dislike the government, but also dislike the coalition that supports the government. And what's peculiar about Latin America, and I think there's a lot of literature now showing this, is that as opposed to the US, where you have the Democrats and the Republicans, most countries in Latin America organize their polarization around a single focal point. So you have the Petistas and the anti-Petistas, the Peronists and the anti-Peronists, rather than having two poles. So there is a positive and a negative identity, rather than two positive identities. So for those cases, again, we go 2019, the Argentine election, and you see a very different, that's a very polarized election. Very people are unhappy with the government, they don't know what they're getting into. And so you had a much higher turnout, and the vote is pretty much divided in the first round between the two main candidates. Very polarized. People have a clear, way of organizing their discontent. And in terms of protest, although I have to say we saw less protest, but we do see protests here. We're seeing of protests that do have organization. So October 2019, at the same that the Chile had those protests for the bus fare, Ecuador had similar protests for increase in the price of gas, and they were pretty brutal. In fact, the government had to move from Quito to Guayaquil. If you were in Quito at the time, you're pretty stuck, but they were organized by the indigenous movement. So at some point, the government had someone to negotiate with and to say, okay, we're putting the gas, we're putting the gas price down, and so the protest fizzled and people came back home. So these are kind of the two phenomena we're trying to understand. The longitudinal one, by increasing discontent, and these two types of discontent. So what are the origins? What explains this? And here when we think of the temporal variation, we think people are comparing. And remember, we're coming from the 1980s and 90s, which were not a great time in the region. And the 2000s, during the commodity boom, especially in South America, had a dramatic effect in terms of growth, decline of poverty, decline of inequality, the emergence of what was called at the time the new middle class, which was a middle class based on income levels, but was quite vulnerable without a safety net. And people were willing to put up with crime, which was already an issue, and to put up with corruption if their welfare, they were not happy, but, they were happier. And I think I was having dinner with Jasmine or someone like, do you remember the Economist had this picture of the Christ in Rio that was like shooting as a rocket, right? This was the idea that this time Latin America was going to do it. So what happened after 2014 is not that there is a crisis like the debt crisis in 82 or the tequila crisis, is that there is a slowdown in growth. And that slowdown in growth over time changes the expectation of people. It generates this sense, we would say, of relative deprivation, that even though things were not necessarily going into a crisis, you see that the trajectory was not there anymore. And that increasing over time brought people to blame the government, because we know that in Americans tend to blame and reward the government for socioeconomic conditions, and that generates this effect, this longitudinal effect on political discourse. And so this is very silly, but like you can see, if you take 2014 as the year, I'm not gonna use this very odd thing, you can see that GDP per capita shoot up. Afterward, with the exception of COVID, it's not that you see a crisis, but the rate of growth changes. The same with poverty. The decline during the commodity boom years versus the stalling afterwards. And here is just an easy measure of, egotropic and sociotropic, what people think of their own economic situation or the country before and after 2015. So there is a sense of, we would argue, relative deprivation behind this longitudinal change that produces political discontent. It's not that we are left behind, it's that we thought this time we would make it, and we are not going to. And there's a lot of gains. I mean, there's an increase in education, an increase of labor market participation, social inclusion. So it looks like things were going to change. There were all these positive expectations that get eroded after the slowdown. And so that erosion of the slowdown, that the effect of COVID would magnify because there was no safety nets, that really is going to generate economic anxiety and a sense of relative deprivation comparing to what your expectations were before. And that's what we associate with protests, with anti-incumbent vote, with increasing electoral volatility. People blame the government. They start to be much less tolerant with crime and corruption, especially with corruption. And that produces the wave of discontent. But we said still, depending on how they assign the blame, you would end up with either the vertical discontent or the horizontal type of discontent. So why is that? So we say that relative deprivation has a process of comparison, an assessment of blame, and a sense of whether this is fair or not. And the comparison with the past explains this kind of longitudinal trajectory, but a comparison with a reference group explains whether you end up with vertical or horizontal discontent. And how you evaluate, I think, again, the idea of the fairness is important because democratization has taught the citizens of the region. This is the region of the developing world that's the most democratic. I know a lot of people here still backsliding and think it's terrible. If you compare with other regions, it doesn't look so well. This is a place where education indicators have improved. As I said, women, inclusion in labor market, inclusion in indigenous groups of Afro-descendants, access to education. You have all these people who have learned their rights and they think they have rights, and now these rights are not effective. Now, there's no exogenous shock. Like, remember that Campello and Succo tell us that even when there is an exogenous shock, people blame the president. Here, there's not even an exogenous shock that they can understand. So prices are, going down, but it's not that there was a huge crisis. And so the question of who you blame really for us depends on the prior experience, on the experience of the distribution that happens during the commodity boom. And whether you blame, a group that has captured the states, or whether you blame all of the political elites that keep being unable to provide anything for these citizens. And so the kind of two alternative really depends on how sustained was the experience with the left side in the period of the commodity boom. Of course, you could say that it's also endogenous to whether you're a natural resource exporter and benefited more from the commodity boom, and whether there's lineage showing that the left had a hard time when there were civil wars. But the question is, in the case that there is work that shows that having left-wing governments during this period resulted in, stronger declines in poverty, on inequality, and a stronger process of redistribution. It also happened that those governments tend to need to build coalitions, so they come in alliances with social movements and organizations that tend to challenge status definitions in those countries, and also are more likely to use the state to do that. So you see an expansion of the public sector. So that generates resentment to those who lose a kind of, in relative terms, their positions. Even if they were improving during the boom, they were not improving as rapidly as these other groups, and tend to associate the rapid improvement of these other groups as capturing the state, as being associated to the increase of the state. So that generates both positive identities of those who benefit and negative identities of those who see themselves as relative losers, and that generates this polarization in the positive, negative identity, the pro and the anti. In those cases, we expect to see more polarization, of course, but also higher turnout because people are more afraid of the consequences, also lower number of effective parties, of course, and lower electoral volatility than in the cases of the vertical discontent. In the cases of vertical discontent, there is a more diffuse idea of whom to blame. There's no, the same experience of the state having done something that changed society so dramatically. It's not that society didn't change, so like think of Peru. It's a huge change in terms of poverty and society, but not so much associated to state policy, right? So people have a much more generalized sense of discontent, the sense that elites are more detached from them. And in fact, two of the chapters, we have the chapter of Flores Macias and his co-authors, looks at public opinion, compares political elites and the masses. And it's interesting that in these cases of vertical discontent, he sees higher gaps. So when the public opinion of the masses is worried, like the main problem is security, elites are still behind. It takes them like 10 years to get there. And we also saw it in the chapter by Juan Pablo Luna, Rodrigo Medel, that they look at how in those cases you would see the elites could be very polarized, but the people are not. It's a kind of disconnected polarization. So they argue that's the case of Peru, that's the case of Chile, that's the case of Guatemala, and it's harder to achieve a stable equilibrium. You keep voting kind of minority presidents that cannot deliver, and people keep being unhappy. So we have, this is basically a description of the variables that I just mentioned: type A volatility, effective everything on the first round presidential elections, effective number of party and voter turnout, to try to classify the countries using the scores for 2015, 2024. And so these are the countries that we argue are the horizontal discontent, and these are the countries that we argue are more associated with vertical discontent. And when we have, here is the change from the period of the boom to the period of the post-boom, which, it shows that there is a correlation. But certainly, what we use this is to try to classify the countries and then try to think of trajectories. So the countries that end up as having horizontal discontent are those that had at least 3. I mean, it's not that 3 was the magical number, it's just that we ended up with at least 3 administrations of the left type. In the case of Argentina, with the Peronis and Kirchnerism all together, I mean, without interruption. In the case of Brazil, with the PT, if you think the two Lula and the Dilma that ends, in Uruguay with the Frente Amplio, in Ecuador with Correa, and Honduras is for us a little bit of an outlier. And here on the other side, we have countries that didn't have the same experience for different reasons. I think most of them are not either because they were not so benefit by the boom, but others like Colombia and Peru, the left didn't make it to power because of history of a civil war, as I mentioned before. And in the case of Chile, there is a wide literature on how the Chilean left tried to restrict redistribution, but there was also a stabilization fund for the copper. So you don't need it was much more, the sterilization of the boom was much more effective in Chile than in the other countries. But again, I think for us, we were associating the prior experience with the boom with this idea of polarization and horizontal discontent and this idea of vertical discontent. Mexico and El Salvador, we thought, and this is something we can discuss, that it really depicts more or less until 2018. And these are two countries that we are thinking are going through populist transitions. And in this, it's transitions to what it's less clear. I think they're transitions to different things. What the book shows is this is just correlations between, and this is purely descriptive, it's just the continental countries, between horizontal and vertical, with the decline in Gini during the boom, with the decline in poverty during the boom, and in both cases was higher for those countries with horizontal discontent than with countries with vertical discontent. We don't have any correlation for social expenditures, but certainly taxation grows more during the boom in the countries with horizontal discontent than in the countries with vertical discontent. As I said, this is a situation that hasn't ended. We are still in the process of the discontent, and we don't have the sense that these two scenarios will be fixed. We think there will be an evolution. We cannot really map it, but because, it's kind of ongoing, but we have some kind of ideas of where we could see the scenarios changing in the future. So two potential trajectories, and I might even discuss a third one. One is this, we have the chapter by Luna and Medel that really argues that this vicious circle of discontent with the elites that are polarized and the people are not tends to produce continuous volatility because you get minority presidents or very weak presidents that are not able to deliver on what the populace, the people want. The risk, and this comes from a Zoom I shared with Aníbal 2 weeks ago, that I think this generates for democratic erosion, and Peru, the work I think of Alberto Vergara and Rodrigo Barrenechea comes to mind as kind of clearly defining, is that in these cases of minority presidents, of very weak presidents, you see a lot of a power vacuum and the check and balances getting main and more power, and that could be captured. So the cases of Peru, the case of Guatemala, where the state is very weak and it gets captured by a strong interest, sometimes even criminal interest. And so, yes, you have a democracy in the sense that you have elections, but the responsiveness of democracy is certainly not working. The alternative, and much more has written about the alternative, is the populist transition, right? People are unhappy with the situation. There is a lot of electoral fragmentation. The barriers to entry come down. You get a lower and lower threshold with with 11% votes, I think Arevalo made it to the president of Guatemala. So it's easier and easier for outsiders to come in, and outsiders can become, rebuild the political system. That's what happened at the end of the prior century. There is a lot written about it. We think that it was easier at the end of the prior century because of the commodity boom. That is harder now. We see Mexico as probably the kind of most hopeful case, although the current policies of the United States might impede that consolidation. But certainly, López Obrador built in very similar terms of economic redistribution, higher minimum wage, and social policies that build a very strong positive identity for a party created pretty much anew, although with a lot of old politicians, and generate a positive and a negative identity. We don't know where that will end. It's still too early to say, but that would be a kind of a trajectory more like the Arabs. The case of Bukele, which is different in our view, because he's only delivering public security, which is a huge concern for Latin American citizens, but it's much harder to build positive identities just around public security without economic welfare. So we think that, it's much more likely, it's already non-democracy, but it's much harder to keep a kind of polarized democracy with the Bukele model. Maybe that's why, and I guess, Laura, maybe that's a point to ask you, that why Uribe was enabled, because he delivered public security, but he wasn't able to do the complete polarization. To what extent, I think this is an argument that Kurt Weyland had made also in his last book, to what extent public security is enough to build political identities. And here the risk for democratic erosion, I don't think needs a lot of explanation. There's tons written on power concentration and the potential it has for eroding democracy. The other question I have, and this is kind of thinking out loud, is how much you sustain a polarized scenario, especially if you don't have stuff to deliver. Because one of the things that happens with the polarized scenario, yes, the relative losers are unhappy, but people that support you also support you because, at the beginning you can say, okay, I'm not giving any more to you because these guys are opposing it because of the backlash. But over time, you need to give something to them so that these identities do not erode. So this is more of a question that I have about what would be the future of that particular scenario. So just so that you get a sense of the book, this is the table of contents. There is a section kind of describing political discontent with chapter by Kessler and Bomaro on scenarios of political discontents and different types of polarization, whether structured or unstructured. A chapter by Luna and Medel. As I mentioned before, they make the case that they make two important arguments for us. They make the case that elites could be polarized and disconnected, and the masses, the citizens, can be completely detached from that polarization. And they make another important argument that's related to crime, both their chapter and the other chapter on crime, which is the importance of state capacity and how crime that erodes state capacity generates differences in political discontent, even within the same country. We have then kind of the origins of political discontent. There are two chapters looking at the young people. One chapter that shows at the impact of having a democratic experience or not, and it doesn't seem that it works. The young people who experience having democratic experience actually makes you less discontent. And another chapter looking at particular social movements involving the young that really looks at issues such as say education. Countries where you increase education rapidly, but the university education has a supply that expensive. You can think of Peru, of Colombia, of Chile, are much more likely to experience these student movements of protest. Also, there is a pattern between the kind of the vertical and the horizontal, to what extent the young movements are connected to parties or not. And again, where they are not connected to parties, then you see a different way of protest. A chapter on crime and that shows what we know, the impact of crime on people supporting the decline of civil liberties. But also, I think, two important points. One that I just mentioned on state capacity and how it explains variation within the same country. But another one, how crime reduces political participation, because people are afraid to express their voice. A chapter on the Venezuelan migration, which was enormous during this period. And here what we find is interesting. There is a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment across the region, but not much political activation of it. So with the exception of the last presidential election in Chile, we see elites not touching something that they could touch. So if you think of the comparison with this country, it's interesting to think why is the case, and it's also framed in different terms. A chapter on informal workers that again looks at how these people that have been included in the non-contributory policy programs has now expectations of social policy redistribution, but certainly much more discontent with democracy than those in the formal sector. And the chapters on gender policy and indigenous discontent really play much more of this horizontal discontent of the different groups and bring religion in the case of the gender politics into the arena and how it plays into the backlash. A nice comparison of Argentina, Brazil, and Peru, and why there is backlash in Brazil and Peru, but not so much in Argentina, although there is working with the party government in both these countries. And finally, the chapter by Alberti on indigenous discontent, which also brings back the issue of institutional weakness and the fact that some of these indigenous movements were granted a lot of constitutional rights, but those constitutional rights are not necessarily effective. And so you see in those countries where they made alliance with political parties, both discontent with the non-compliance and discontent of those on the other side with the backlash. So let me conclude for the questions. We're really trying to provide a framework to understand political discontent. I mean, this is an edited volume, but we want to bring back this idea of looking at the historical experience of Latin America. I think there's a lot of work now on, democratic backsliding and political discontent, and it all doesn't fit on the same bucket. We emphasize the issue of relative deprivation because the region is still better off than it was 30 years ago in many senses. In social terms, and even in political terms, if we think, and it's that those wins that were made would make people exercise their voice and be discontent with their political elites. There's also the issue that this is a continuous process. There's not like a starting point with a crisis, and it hasn't produced any stable equilibrium. We cannot write the kind of Ken Robert books of how the political system changed. But it's important for us to highlight both, this kind of sense of social democratization that make it political democracy a much higher task, and the weakness of state capacity that, we all have written about and has continues. This is a long-standing problem of the region, but one that has accelerated in recent years, especially with the increase in crime. And again, we are not saying that this happens in a vacuum. There is like a larger process of discontent with democracy, of acceleration of times, of, as you know, the social media and all of that. But we really think it's important to recover what's particular of the Latin American experience. Thank you.
So why don't we open it for the Q&A? Who would like to start us off?
Just a quick measurement question. Could you tell us a little bit more how like you measure specifically vertical and horizontal?
So we use, I mean, it's really rough in the sense, we use the volatility of entrance, type A volatility, I think that's called, measure from like when new parties enter the system, the effective number of parties in the first round election, so, you know, presidential candidates. We use it a measure of polarization and basically inverting it for vertical and horizontal, and the voter turnout. Scott?
Thank you. Always great to hear your work. I have a follow-up on Jessica's question, which is, I didn't get why you use those concepts, vertical and horizontal approaches. And just a couple of data questions. One is, I mean, to my surprise, right, I don't think I'd seen this graph with per capita GDP. I would have expected exactly what you reported, but it looked to me as though the growth trajectory doesn't flatten that much until 2020. So I think there's a gap. You know, you're right, the protests increased dramatically mid-decade, but I don't think that the graph that you showed, unless I misread it. And then the third thing, another data question, it looked to me as though some of the correlations you showed were pretty weak, like minus 0.17.
No, that's a no correlation there.
Yeah, but many of them were pretty weak. So I'm just wondering, like, how, I thought your argument would predict strong correlations, and I don't think that that's mostly the case. Again, I might have misread, but that was my quick take.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the data. I think the acceleration, you know, I mean, this is just the GDP. So the acceleration, it's really started to slow down, in fact, even a little bit before 2014 on GDP per capita. And it's a process, that's what we say, really. It's not that it's like there is a crisis in 2014, but I would think that it's right kind of around here. That like, and the data, the micro data, there's actually a paper by Juan Carlos Cruces and the Settler people, and they use the micro data of census, which is much more detailed, and they show that there is a decline actually around 2012 off. So even before like 2014. And they show a correlation between these. Again, they say it's not a drop, it's like a slowdown, and that correlates, like we find, with more discontent with democracy and more lack of data. The correlations, I mean, this is not an article, it's like an introduction to a book. So we're trying to provide a frame from what we learned from the chapters. And so the correlations, there's only 11 observations are weak. And are just we're building on the work of Feigenhardt and Lustig and others that have done work with like much more strong data, but to show that there is some credence to the argument. We haven't really tested the argument in that sense. We then don't show the correlations as a test, but as an illustration of the patterns. But again, I think the idea of vertical and horizontal is for us important because this discontent, in some cases, produces this extreme polarization, a situation more similar to the United States, and in other cases produces an incredibly electoral fragmentation and volatility and a more generalized discontent with the system. And that's why we think those patterns were kind of there, and we wanted to try to understand how they connect with the different aspects that we analyze. So the influence of crime was higher in one than the other, whether there were alliances of, say, indigenous movements or gender-related movements with a party or not, and how those match up. And again, like for instance, on the gender chapter by Viroli, what's interesting is, yes, there are alliances in Brazil and Argentina and not in Peru, but also the level of popular religiosity explains, both the party system and the, popular religiosity explain those alliances and then the subsequent patterns that we see.
So let me try to get two questions because I have a long list. Sorry, Scott, did you have a follow-up or?
Well,
I felt that you were itching.
If I may, no, I mean, so why vertical and horizontal as opposed to, I mean, I'm just trying to be helpful here, but why not like discontent under conditions of high fragmentation versus discontent under bipolar competition? That's what you're that's.
Well, because it's horizontal is like I'm discontented with you. Like, I'm not just discontent with the elites above me, but I'm discontented with my peers who support the elites. And vertical, I'm only discontent with the elites above me. It's the kind of.
So let me get two questions. I have Diana and Guillermo on the list.
Thank you, Vicky. This was super helpful framework, but I wonder if you could expand or help me understand where kind of both the quantity and character of welfare state expansion during this period figures in this framework. Because while we have this kind of overall expansion of the welfare state across the board in Latin America during this period, there are variations. And so where does that figure in this framework and these trajectories that you show outside of just this equation of security and delivering?
Guillermo, do you want to add your question and Vicky can take two at a time?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Vicky. There's lots of great stuff here. I look forward to reading the book. Let me get to the question of trajectories, because indeed, things may not look as bad in Latin America as in other world regions in terms of democratic backsliding. But the trajectories that you outlined don't seem to be, on the one hand, you say, well, Peru, Guatemala, Chile, maybe outsiders may come in. So not so much in terms of institutional sustainability. And then the second alternative is the populist transitions. And I see these images and I get back to the baseline that you presented, which was a period in which, or several countries that underwent transitions to democracy, and there was a period of expansion of rights. So let me just try to put those two images together, because I've been blown away, and I'm speaking a bit as a researcher, but also as an activist in southern Mexico, the city of Acapulco, doing lots of face-to-face interviews with young children. This is a focal point of crime, violence, disappearances. And when we ask these kids about their dreams, what they say is, on the one hand, they dream about society without violence, but then they say, I want to live in a society where rights are fulfilled. But they speak the language of second and third generation rights. So they say, I want the right, and these are kids and adolescents, the right to live a healthy life, to mental health, to have food on the table, to well-being, and so on and so forth. So this is the question. If you look at, and again, children and similar experience with adolescents in southern Mexico, they speak the language of rights. What difference does it make when these populations express their discontent in terms of rights? So when these young people spearhead rights-based movements as opposed to other forms of discontent, because up to this point, it's been very much of a, you're looking at the elites, But when you were responding, to Scott, you're saying, horizontal is, I judge you in terms of how you view elites. But I'm trying to push a bottom-up approach, thinking about the chapters, the young people, the adolescents, the indigenous peoples. If they fight for rights, aren't we missing, or maybe the book is pointing at us at maybe a third trajectory that may be more hopeful, but very different from the type of democracy, very elite-based that we usually think about?
So great question. So the welfare state expansion is again, based on the work of others, what we argue was stronger under left-side, continuous left-side government. So that's why I said the comparison, it's not that you don't see a reduction in poverty and economic growth in the case of Peru, but much more because of market action and labor markets than because of the state. In the cases where the state, like say Brazil, where the state played a pretty strong role with a lot of policies, that's where we would expect horizontal discontent, because that's when someone can identify, okay, these people are better off than me because of state policy. So that's the way it comes into the argument. So Guillermo, I think that's a great point you made. And in fact, we think that most of these political discontents are expressed in terms of rights. That's why we are kind of hopeful. We think this is the result of democratization. This is the result of democratization, maybe not working at the elite levels, but working in society. And elites cannot deal with it, don't know how to deal with it. But that's why it's different. Like, we're not seeing calls for revolution, insurgency. We're seeing political discontent expressed because the elites are not responsive to the people, are not delivering on the promise of rights. They're not enforcing the institutions that they created to solve the problem. So I think all of the chapters look at the demand side and have this take. I don't know, and that's why I say this is an unfinished process. What we've seen so far are cases where you have either a populist leader emerging, and we can discuss how we think of Morena and the experience in Mexico, or these cases where, although the barriers of entry are very low, we don't even have a populist leader. We keep having these kind of elites that Peru is the perfect example. Super polarized elites, but disconnected. The majority of the people don't care. And I think I had this conversation with I'm in New York with a Wall Street person, and that was the 2021 election. And I said to her, "Oh, what do you think of the election in Peru?" And she said, "I don't care. The election in Peru really, it doesn't matter. The policies will be the same. It doesn't matter who wins the election in Peru," which would be very different from, say, Brazil or Argentina. So again, there is a sense in which, yes, the problem might be that the elites are unresponsive, do not know how to deal with it. But what's different about this wave of discontent is that it's kind of emerging from the rights of democracy. And even I think in the worst case scenario, the Salvadorian case, people are asking for public security. I mean, that's true in Mexico. That was the beginning of your conversation. You need the Jovesian state to start, and then, there are other rights. So I do think that there is a different kind of, and that's why I think it's political voice in the Hirschen state. Sense.
I have a question over here, and then Luis, we'll get into these again.
Laura, I think.
Two finger?
No, I put me in the list.
Okay. Sure.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a question about the role of women-led protest, feminist protest. I'm thinking about the cases of Argentina, very importantly, in Mexico too, Chile, Colombia, pro-abortion protests and protests against gender-based violence. How do they fit in this model of political discontent? You mentioned a couple of times that it seems to be a horizontal type of discontent, but I think it can also be, the way it is voiced, it also seems to be vertical. So I'm just trying to fit it all in there.
So, can you answer?
Yeah, Luis, and then you answer.
Thank you. This was fascinating. I mean, you have helped us organized chaos, and now we will use these labels, so it's really powerful. So actually, one of the comments I had is similar to Laura's in that where cases are heterogeneous inside and you have both kinds of discontent within country, right? And you could even think of Millei's coalition, the kind of informal worker, former parents voters seem more like a vertical kind of discontent. They often don't vote, and the more like affectively polarized or the more ideological one. So the degree to which there is heterogeneity within. And relatedly, and this goes back to what Guillermo and Scott were asking about, like I heard your talk as a much more bottom-up talk than elite-based talk. So I was actually wondering about the role of elites in that there could be heterogeneity over time, right? As like you could just as well see the Argentine trajectory as one that has the Milei outcome is a more kind of vertical type of contestation after a more polarized situation. So it seems, and Chile could go actually the reverse trajectory, right? Let's see what happens in the election. God forbid, but there is a things as well there. And so I wonder where this discontent is more malleable if elites shape it in different ways. And just one last comment. I wonder in the horizontal trajectory if it's not an alternative explanation, but something that is complementary and an additional factor is the role of, because it looks like all of these stories have a lot of right-wing backlash component, right? So, and the degree to which it's asymmetric polarization, which is more because it's backlash against the Kirchners, backlash against PT. So, and that in that sense, Latin America looks more like Europe.
Okay. So two things. So what for the feminist and the LGBTQ movements. So what the chapter shows is Argentina and Brazil are cases of horizontal discontent because the feminist and LGBTQ movement associated with a party in government and made gains during the left tide. And so that generated the backlash, the discontent from the relative losers, the kind of conservative discontent, more in Brazil than in Argentina because of the levels of religiosity. In the case of Peru, which is the third case it lost, you have a case of vertical discontent. So, there's not really much of, and a very lot of religiosity, not much of a strong feminist movement on anyone to make an alliance. But Chile is a good case that in the sense that you had a strong feminist movement because religiosity is lower, but there was no real coalition that captures the movement in the same way that it did in Argentina and in Brazil. And so the argument that Biroli makes is that you would expect the backlash to be a combination of whether you have, an alliance with a party in government and the level of religiosity that builds into the backlash. Now, the other point that she made, and this comes back to the issue of heterogeneity, is that once you activate the feminist movement and there is this demand for rights, if the rights don't happen, then you get the backlash and the discontent of those who are expecting those rights. So in those contexts of horizontal discontent, you have like two people unhappy with it. That's why we call it horizontal, because there is also the unhappiness at each other and also at a situation that does not fulfill the rights. Elites. We have one chapter on elites, that's right. The most of the book really looks at the demand side. And even in the chapter of the elites, we look at how connected the elites are with public opinion, with more general public opinion. The idea of the book was looking at those who were discontent. And the elites, are those to whom the discontent is directed. So we don't look at them in particular, except in relation to the citizenship. Again, I think we can discuss Milei, but it could be a transitional situation in two different ways. It could be a transition from polarized to fragmented, maybe what we're seeing in Bolivia, that's kind of, or it could be a transition from who is the anti-parentist. So I don't know what's the real transition. It's too early to say. So that's why I say this is a process. I mean, I don't predict the future. So it's hard for me to say. The Chilean election, I follow the surveys and I think they change, I don't know if you can correct, but they change relatively fast from in short terms of time to talk to me of a very polarized at the mass level. If it's really polarized at the mass level, we knew, for instance, in the prior election that, people, whomever was the Peronist candidate was going to get X number of votes, even if it was Alberto Fernandez, who nobody had heard about before he was chosen by Cristina, right? Whereas in Chile, you see a lot of volatility between Matei and Cast and Jara and who knows, maybe Parisi reemerges. So I don't see a similar situation in this.
I have Abby and then someone. Can you find me? Okay. Zelda.
Thank you for the great talk, Vicky. I know the book focuses on explaining this content, but I would like to know more about the implications of this content for democracy in the region and more the normative, if you have any normative implications of this content, right? In the literature, particularly public opinion, there has been a debate, on one side, political legitimacy and, trust in the system is a good thing. On the other one, no, that's actually not the case, and we want this content. And I'm asking because clearly in some of the cases that you are mentioning, I can see that this content can save democracy in a way, or at least maybe bring democracy back, right? So I don't know what we make of this content and if this is just cycles of this content that are healthy and that we are thinking that maybe the coming back of democracy in some cases, it will happen similarly to the transitions to democracy that we saw, say, Brazil, with people mobilizing to demand regime change. But then I'm linking this back to your first statement in which it appears that now citizens are I have rights. But I don't know that statement, whether it translates also into we are going to stand up against human rights violations, right? And or just I don't have food or I want security, but whether people are willing to go beyond that, the more kind of self-interest related kind of rights. And I'm saying this because yes, this content brought, Milei, a populist leader, and in the case of El Salvador, my own country, currently the country cannot be called a democracy, first of all, because we have a unconstitutionally elected president. And so, also the repression we are seeing in some cases, and some countries that already are full dictatorship, like in Nicaragua. So what's your take, in conclusions from the book and the evidence that we have over time of what this content does or doesn't? And, I don't want to say I'm advocating for this content, but what do we make of it?
Argentinians are with this content. It's like a natural state.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this interesting talk and stimulating. Now, let me say first, democracy is allowed discontent. Yeah. And so, is this something bad for democracy? No. People will express themselves. Of course, there's a police repression, and police who don't repress well should be jailed, right? That's equity jail. The police who did their job badly have been prosecuted. And so that's democracy. Now, this period coincides also with huge protests, especially in France and Spain. The French is even, I think, worse than the Chilean in terms of the amount of discontent, the amount of the people involved and so on. And so, yeah, this is going on. When you say that in Chile, there's no organization, I take issue with that. Yes, the first incident was somebody who jumped the turnstiles in the metro and was arrested, and then that began a local protest. But let's go back in time. There were protests led by the student movement continuously since 2009, and that created political leadership that was then elected to the parliament and then to the presidency, right? So this is a long-standing source of the rise of political leadership going back into history. Frey was the same. He was a protest leader in his youth at the university and so on. Creates new parties, created the Christian. So this is a repetition of something that we've seen in Chilean politics before. Now, when you say no organization for protest later, the picture that you saw there with the 1 million person march, that was organized by a whole set of organizations, not only the student movement, but also the food central, the movement, and a very strong group of organization which is called, protests against the AFP pension system, right? The privatized pension system. Those people have been protesting alongside of the students. People have focused more on the students than on the elderly people who joined this organization, no más AFP. And so they have been active over the years, and they were one of the principal organizers of that big march. That's why so many people come. Now, you did mention migration, but I think the migration has a much greater importance in this whole picture than you presented it as. Now, take the per capita income. Per capita income means, of course, if you have a higher population, you have a lower per capita income. And we calculated the per capita income of Chile now. It would be $40,000 per year, right? $40,000 at PPP prices, right? It's now 34,000. So that's $6,000 less per capita income because 2 million people have entered the country. Now, when you have this huge migration, and this is, you mentioned Venezuela, that's very important. Venezuela is very important in this. A huge migration of people into Colombia, into Peru, and especially into Chile. Chile's population increased by 2 million, which is equivalent to 34 million if it were the US. Now, when you have that huge inflow of people, that means that you have to provide more schooling, more daycare centers, more housing, access to health. All these things get strained, right? Because of the huge influx of people. So that, of course, and also housing. That is bound to generate some kind of discontent as well, because you have competition for low-level wages. There's nothing that will stimulate protest more than competition for low-level wages. So, yeah, I would add a whole bunch of things and give different weight to things that you mentioned. In this manner.
Before I turn it over to Vicky, let me get Laura in the queue, because I will never forgive myself if I don't.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. So this is super interesting. Thank you so much, Vicky. I had a question about inclusion, right? So you're telling a story about welfare, and I wonder if it's a story about inclusion in two ways. The first is kind of in this idea of inclusionary turn, right? And sort of in line with the work of Laura Garcia Montoya and other people that have argued that in the early 2000s, what some countries did was create mechanisms of equality, while others, what they did was just mechanisms to reduce poverty, right? And of course, we saw the end of this during COVID. And so I wonder if there's some distinction in that. In my very limited knowledge about this, for me, when you talk about increasing the welfare, it could be either mechanism, right? But really, this seems to be a story about inclusion. The other way in which I'm thinking about inclusion has to do about sort of how groups organize, right? And so you talk about how there is this general discontent, and I wonder to what extent, and I know you don't want to bring elites into this, but I wonder to what extent this is also a story about inexistent organizations to organize, be it lack of political parties, but also lack of or weakness of unions or other kind of groups that could potentially mobilize society towards a more unified goal, right? Like I'm thinking about Colombia 2019, 2021. One of the main characteristics of those protests was that neither parties nor unions represented the people on the streets, right? They couldn't deal with the protests, A, because Duque is Duque, but B, because they couldn't create sort of mechanisms to dialogue with them in a sort of a centralized way, right? Like you had to have conversations with multiple groups. So I wonder if this is also a story about that.
Yeah. Can I answer
Get the
now?
final words.
Okay, so great questions and comments. And Abby, I don't make a normative assessment. I have my own, but the book doesn't. No, I mean, I started my career studying labor unions, right? And I am always suspicious of people who ask from other people not to be self-interest. You know, really, most people care about themselves and you know, yes, when you have the luxury of like being not self-interest, maybe works. But if you care about like your own security, your family security, both in terms of crime and food, I mean, I don't ask from these people something that I don't know that I will be able to deliver. And so I tend to believe that if people are discontent, and guess this is the urgent, I think there is a reason and that the democracy promises rights and that democracy should deliver, people should be part of this delivery. It's not that you expect an elite to come and deliver. But so I don't have such a negative view of political discontent. I think that discontent, Samuel, these are great points, are different from Europe. I think even the Green Vest, I mean, I'm working on agriculture, so I follow the Green Vest movement in France closely. Those are people who are the yellow vest, sorry, the yellow vest, yeah. And so those are people, I think it's a different type of discontent. It's a discontent because they're losing kind of a status quo that was good for them in that sense. Although I have to say that when gas prices increase, people realize you're right about that. Now, the Chilean movement, I think it's an interesting case. I agree with you, there were protests in the prior years led by the student movement, of which the current president is one of the outcomes. There was the pension, there was the zona de sacrificio. There were like many different demands. And
all rights.
Yeah. But those were not included in the political system. In fact, the president made his own party, which is a little small party with not so many connections with society. It's not that. And so in that sense, it recalls much more what Laura described, right? Like there is not an organization. Think of the Chile pre-Allende, right? Of a party that could represent the unions, the peasants, the different social movements. I mean, there are these groups there, but they're disconnected from the political system. And the agreement was made by political parties. There is a disagreement there. And the migration is true in the sense that Chile has a very large increase in the population. Now, the majority of the Venezuelans are in Colombia. I mean, in numbers. Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador have a larger number of Venezuelans than Chile. And what's interesting for us, I think in all the countries we observe is the growth of the anti-immigrant, anti-Venezuelan sentiment.
Peruvians,
everywhere, Peruvians, Ecuadorians. I mean, the larger the number of Venezuelans, migrants you have, the larger the anti-immigrant sentiment. It's pretty easy. What's interesting for us is why, and this is coming back to the list, it's not politicized in some countries. So why do the Colombians, that's where the highest anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Venezuelan sentiment is. Why do the Colombian elites choose not to touch this topic in the left, where the Chilean do? So that's what's surprising for us. It's a latent issue everywhere. But some choose to politicize it in the elections and other countries don't. So that's why I said, not that it's not an issue. The whole chapter shows it's an issue. And the other thing that the chapter shows that I guess is relevant for the United States is, I mean, these groups, these migrants, they're more culturally like the native population. So the kind of the frame of the anti-immigrant sentiment, it's much more in terms of crime than in cultural terms. Everywhere, even in Bolivia, it's like the Venezuelans are criminals. So that's interesting as well in how do the framing works.
Yeah, a lot of professionals from Venezuela too, but everywhere.
Yes, same is in Argentina. I mean, the first wave of Venezuelans, they all came on a plane. They are in Argentina, in Chile, and in Chile, they already have voting rights and vote for the right.
After 5 years.
Yeah. So, but I don't think the problem is with them. The problem is with the more recent waves that came through the other countries in the north of Chile. That's where the immobilized.
It stagnates wages, it creates housing.
Maybe we can continue later. Any final words?
No, I mean, just thank you guys for being here, for great comments, and it's always a pleasure to be here and hear what you have to say. I mean, such a privilege for any student of Latin America to be here.
Thank you, Vicky. You're welcome.
I just
No te convencí.
Did you see? Did you see?